Nikon announced the replacement for the D5 in February 2020. So the D6 is out and is about to ship in a couple of weeks perhaps. So I thought this was a good time to take a look at what's new from the D5 and whether it's truly worth buying it for wildlife photography. So let's dive in and find out. Okay, we need to start by understanding that Nikon's flagship camera, that is the D single digit series, is mainly targeted at sports photographers. And that's exactly why Nikon tends to update it every Olympic year. The previous iteration, the D5, came out in 2016. The Tokyo Olympics were scheduled for later this year and unfortunately rescheduled for next year due to the COVID situation. But nevertheless, the D6 is out. And for it to be really an improvement over the D5, considering that it's targeted at sports photographers and professional journalists, it needs to excel at three areas mainly. That's speed, autofocus, and functionality. So what I thought was I'll make a list for you of what's new over the D5 in these three areas so that you can yourself decide whether it's worth it. And at the end, I'm going to list out the things that I was expecting Nikon to update which weren't updated. And finally, I'll share my view on whether it's worth having this camera for wildlife photography. So let's look at some of the things that have been improved in the speed department. The first, predictably, is with continuous burst speed, which is up to 14 frames per second from 12. The second is what I think the truly big improvement, which is the ability to shoot a staggering 60 frames a second at 2K resolution and 30 frames per second at 4K resolution. The third is that if you're into a type of photography which requires you to be very discreet and silent, such as, let us say, you're a wedding photographer and do a lot of photography in churches or religious places, or you do a lot of your photography from hides, you certainly don't want to alert that bear to come check you out or run away from you, then this is something that will perhaps interest you. The D6 can shoot at 10.5 frames per second quietly in the live view mode. You don't want to use the live view mode because the autofocus isn't as great in it. Then in the conventional quiet mode using the viewfinder, it can manage up to 5 frames per second, whereas that figure was 3 for the D5. And not just that, you can actually choose a range of speeds from 1 to 5 frames per second. Although I can't really understand why you would want to shoot at 1 frame per second when you can actually do 5, especially when the resolution of the D6 is quite the same as the D5 at 21 megapixels, which shouldn't be too hard for you to manage in terms of file sizes. Next up is the holy grail of action cameras, autofocus. Here the very first improvement I think is a significant one, which is the number of autofocus points, which has gone up to 105, all of which are selectable, and crucially and very impressively, all of which are cross type, including 15 points which are compatible with f8 shooting. Now for anybody who cares a lot about composition, particularly in-field composition, without leaving it to post-production to crop to compose your subjects, this is absolutely a godsend. Secondly, Nikon says that they've enabled eye-controlled autofocus in the auto AF area mode and 3D tracking. Third, there are now 17 customizable group area modes for autofocus area selection. And lastly, for macro photographers, there is an automated focus stacking feature in order to be able to get more depth of field at large apertures and close distances. But of course, you still have to use third-party software to stitch them all together in post-production. And lastly, we have functionality. And the single biggest feature that stands out for me is actually ironically something that landscape photographers are likely to use more, which is the 15-minute exposure time. Yes, you can now set a 900-second shutter speed on the D6. Now, every other Nikon DSLR and almost all other DSLRs in the past have had a maximum exposure time of 30 seconds, which is very restrictive, particularly for landscape photographers when you're trying to make star trails and other long exposures, and you are compelled to use a remote. I call this the coffee mode actually, because you can now set a 10-minute exposure or a 12-minute exposure or a 15-minute exposure, go have a coffee and come back and your picture is ready. The second one is more like a relief, a long-standing disservice that Nikon has corrected, and that is the addition of inbuilt Wi-Fi into the D6, finally. Thirdly, you now have a fully touch-enabled LCD as against the D5's limited touch functionality. Next up is a curious JPEG plus JPEG mode, which seems to be targeted at some sort of a JPEG enthusiast. If you want one small JPEG, for instant transfer to your base, and another JPEG and not a RAW file for your records, then this is the mode that you can use. Next up, if you shoot exclusively for Instagram, you'll love this. You now have a 1:1 crop mode. Number 6 is the addition of the highlight weighted metering mode from the D850. Of course, it was first seen in the D500, works brilliantly, so that's a welcome addition. So there you go, those are the things that Nikon added, but there were some things that I was expecting them to add which they conspicuously failed to do. First, Nikon seems to have really meted out stepmotherly treatment to the D6 in the video department, honestly. It still does not have full frame 4K shooting, which in the D5 itself was a huge miss in my opinion. The second is lack of 120 FPS slow motion photography. Now Nikon says in their marketing material that you can make beautiful slow-mo videos at 60 FPS. Come on, not really. I mean, 120 frames per second is the minimum speed that you need, in my opinion, to make any sort of good-looking slow-motion video. So that is a disappointment as well, particularly in 2020, when virtually every other camera seems to have it. And not to mention your pocket mobile cameras, which, by the way, is also a segment DSLRs are competing against to survive. Just saying. The third one is a biggie. No more support for your CF cards, compact flash cards. And that's really bad news for legacy users who are invested heavily in CF cards. Unfortunately, they're just paperweights now with the D6. And they're not heavy enough to be paperweights, so perhaps they're even more useless than useless. XQD cards, however, are completely compatible along with CF Express. So there are dual slots and both of them are compatible with both XQD and CF Express. And still no articulating LCD. In the name of structural rigidity, the D6 does not have an LCD that can move up and down at least, if not twist. So in other words, if you're a filmmaker, unfortunately the D6 really doesn't support you in a big way. And lastly, in an era where virtually every other manufacturer is trying to make things lighter and smaller, the D6 is almost 45 grams heavier than the outgoing D5. And it's not like the D5 was light anyway. If you're a sports photographer or a journalist who actually wants the fastest possible camera and you don't mind it weighing like a brick on your shoulders, but you want to make sure that it can survive a bomb blast, then of course you know who you are and you're going to buy it anyway. Now the big question is it a good camera for wildlife? And the long answer is long, so the short answer is probably not the best that you can buy. The reason I say that is because there are cameras which have sufficient or adequate speed for wildlife photography, which are way lighter and smaller, and most importantly don't cripple you in the video department. And they cost less, which means that you can save that money and put that into a trip, or perhaps get yourself a better lens instead. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.